Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We have a lot to look at this weekend, including the opening of Steven Spielberg's latest movie, Disclosure Day, as we head into what might be the biggest weekend of the summer so far with the opening of Toy Story 5 this Friday. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's get into this past weekend's box office results. And the number one movie, as expected, was Disclosure Day, which came in at $44.5 million. That's a little ahead of what some people estimated, but not a huge overperformance. And there's a lot to break down as far as that film's performance in a few minutes. In second place, I'm out of superlatives with this movie. It's Obsession. It's back up to number 2. It dropped just 25% from the previous weekend for a $19 million weekend number 5. It's close to $200 million domestically. This movie's performance is an absolute phenomenon. There's nothing else to say about it that we haven't already said except to marvel at its continuing performance. And it set a couple of interesting benchmarks this past weekend that I want to talk about. In third place was Scary Movie. What a steep drop. 73.9%. Incredibly front-loaded film. Luckily, it did have a pretty low production budget, so it's going to be profitable, but not long-lived at the box office, and made $14.2 million. It's at an $84.2 million domestic total. Backrooms also proving to be somewhat front-loaded at a 56.1% drop in weekend number 3 and an $11.5 million weekend, but it's at $160.2 million. Of course, also even a lower budget than Scary Movie, A24's biggest movie ever, but definitely not the staying power that we're seeing with Obsession. In fifth place was Masters of the Universe. It did not have a great debut on its opening weekend, and it had a nearly 70% drop in its second weekend. Many people want to talk about the economics of this film from a streaming perspective, and that's perfectly valid. But from a box office perspective, it is not going to be a big performer. It's at 46.9 domestic and dropping like a stone. In sixth place was Star Wars, The Mandalorian and Grogu, which is now pretty much destined to be the lowest grossing live action Star Wars film. It dropped another 51.8% to bring in $4.8 million. It's at $165.1 million domestic. Michael hanging around the top 10 in its 8th week of release. It dropped 44.8% for a $4.2 million weekend and a $362 million domestic total. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we look at the worldwide box office. There was a live viewing of a BTS concert happening in Busan that brought in a reported $3.8 million on Saturday night. That's good enough for 8th place in the top 10. Then we have two new films, The Furious, which I still haven't had a chance to see, but I've heard great things about. It brought in $2.8 million. And the RuPaul film, Stop That Train, brought in just over $2 million in 10th place. Dropping out of the top 10, we have The Devil Wears Prada 2, the movie that kicked off the summer, out of the top 10 after 6 weeks to make room for another Emily Blunt movie. The Breadwinner from comedian Nate Bargatze is out after 2 weeks. Pressure also out after 2 weeks. And The Amazing Digital Circus, The Last Act, is out of the top 10 after 1 week. There are a couple of things I want to talk about with that movie in a few minutes. Looking at the biggest theater count changes this past weekend, The Breadwinner lost the most theaters, 1,246 of them. It's in just over 2,000. The Devil Wears Prada 2 lost 800 theaters. It's still in 1,000. Star Wars, The Mandalorian and Grogu lost a chunk of theaters, 675 of them. It's still in 2,680. Pressure lost 515 theaters. It's still in over 1,300. And Passenger lost the majority of its remaining theaters. It lost 441. It's still in 184. And I think we can look at some pretty steep theater drops this upcoming weekend, with a lot of theater owners making room for multiple screenings of Toy Story 5. This is what the weekend box office this past weekend looked like compared to the same weekend last year in 2025. Now, we did see a 20% drop off in business compared to the same weekend last year because How to Train Your Dragon opened at the same time. So a bit of a dip after a good start to June, but I think that we're going to be looking at a big gain for this upcoming weekend at the box office. Just to put it in perspective, all movies on this upcoming weekend last year made about $125 million. That's every movie in release. Toy Story 5 is looking to do more than that just on its own. So I think we are going to see a big jump in box office for this weekend upcoming, versus the comparable one last year, and it's really going to add to the June total that we've seen so far. The domestic box office, by the way, is now over $4 billion. So let's take a deeper dive into some of the movies that were in the top 10, and we will start with Disclosure Day. As far as domestic opening weekends, it was the 10th best weekend of the year. It's going to get bumped off of this chart by the opening of Toy Story 5, which will likely be the biggest opening of the year. There's a chance that it could come in below Super Mario Galaxy, but I doubt it. I think it's going to be number one. So 1 week on this chart for Steven Spielberg. Looking at his biggest opening weekends as a director, this is unadjusted for inflation, and it's looking at the first Friday through Sunday for the movies that he has put out in theaters, although many of them have to have asterisks, as you can see, because he had a lot of Thursday openers, a lot of Wednesday openers. Just looking at the Friday through Sunday numbers, Disclosure Day had the 5th best opening for Steven Spielberg, behind Jurassic Park, which opened to $50 million back in 1993, War of the Worlds, which opened to $64.8 million back in 2005, although that opened on a Wednesday, so it had 2 days of release before those opening weekend numbers. The Lost World, Jurassic Park, which opened to $74.6 million back in 1997, and Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which had a $100 million opening weekend back in 2008, despite officially opening on a Thursday. The rest of the top 5 includes Ready Player One, which was a Thursday opener, Minority Report back in 2002, Saving Private Ryan in 1998, Catch Me If You Can at number 9 with $30 million, although it was a Wednesday opener, and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade back in 1989. That movie also was a Wednesday opener. Of course, Steven Spielberg is one of the most legendary directors in Hollywood, and that means he's been around for a very long time. So let's take a look at what his highest opening weekends are when you adjust those numbers for inflation. Disclosure Day, spoiler alert, does not make the top 10. His biggest opening weekend adjusted for inflation is The Lost World, Jurassic Park, with an adjusted opening weekend of $182.2 million back in 1997. That really puts it in perspective just how anticipated that movie was. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull gets bumped down to second with $162 million. Then we have War of the Worlds at $115.5 million, Jurassic Park at $108.3 million, and then the first new movie on this list, which is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It opened on Wednesday back in 1984, but still made an adjusted total of $81.2 million on its first Friday through Sunday weekend. That's followed by Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which had pretty much the same case, a Wednesday opener at $78.8 million adjusted for inflation. Then we have Saving Private Ryan, which opened to $73.1 million adjusted for inflation. Minority Report at $71.1 million. AI, Artificial Intelligence, which opened to $60 million adjusted for inflation back in the summer of 2001, and Catch Me If You Can at $59.9 million over the Christmas holiday of 2002. And it's been interesting to see how a lot of the trades and the media have treated this opening weekend, because Disclosure Day had a budget of around $115 million, probably about 85 as far as marketing goes. So it's about a $200 million investment for the studio, and it opened pretty good. It opened a little bit above expectations. It was not a flop, but it also wasn't a huge hit. And it's always interesting to see in one of these sort of middle ground movies what the narrative constructed around these films is. For example, there was some reporting done on Rotten Tomatoes, and I saw several stories saying that this was the biggest original opening for a Steven Spielberg film. And this has generally been the tone of a lot of the industry reporting, is that they want to make it out as to why this was a historic win for Steven Spielberg. And it's true, it is the biggest original opening for a Steven Spielberg film. But when you look back at his filmography, you could say generously that he has made 11 original films as defined in the article, meaning not based on original IP or pre-existing IP, I should say, and not a sequel. And he's only made 4 of those movies this century. Now, if you take out movies that are based on actual people and historical events, that number drops down to 8 movies across his career. And the last quote-unquote original Steven Spielberg film would have been The Terminal, which was made over 20 years ago. So as far as Steven Spielberg's big original hits, those mostly go back to the 70s and 80s, along with Saving Private Ryan back in the 90s. So yes, it is technically true. Disclosure Day did have the biggest opening for an original quote-unquote Steven Spielberg film, but he hasn't made a lot of those across his career, and it's been a long time since he made one. This was another one. The New York Times had an article about Steven Spielberg curing his summer box office drought. It said, Mr. Spielberg has not had a hit, excluding sequels or remakes, at the summer box office in 24 years. And I think, first of all, that it's kind of an interesting way to approach the article, which is like Steven Spielberg hasn't had a hit in 24 years, except for the movies that were hits that were disqualifying because they were sequels or, based on other stuff. But when you exclude those films, in the last 24 years, and they're basically saying this was his biggest summer hit since Minority Report, those criteria only include one other movie as far as summer big budget Spielberg movies, and that's the BFG, which came out 10 years ago. So the summer box office drought that was cured by Disclosure Day only includes one other movie. It's not like he was making a bunch of other summer movies that weren't doing well. But again, it's sort of trying to spin this as kind of a game-changing career resurgence for Steven Spielberg. And the fact is that this was a fine performance for Disclosure Day. It didn't blow anybody's socks off, but it didn't flop catastrophically either. It is a movie that critics pretty much enjoyed. It's a movie with a mixed word of mouth with audiences, a B Cinema score, a Rotten Tomatoes score, audience score around 70%. The online discussion about the movie has been incredibly negative, including on both videos that I've done about it. So there are some questions that can be asked about what the future prospect of the film is going to be, but it's really hard to build a narrative around the opening weekend because it doesn't really tell much of a story. But that is kind of the way that the media and the entertainment media works, is that if there's not a narrative, then we have to build one. We've talked about it with The Mandalorian and Grogu. We've talked about it with Masters of the Universe. But the truth of the matter is, and it's a very boring truth, is that Disclosure Day did perfectly all right, and we'll see where it goes from there. And that brings us to the results of last week's member poll. I asked members here on the channel, what is your favorite Steven Spielberg movie? And there was a winner running away. It was Jurassic Park with 76 votes, 50 votes more than the second place movie. I expected there to be a lot of different movies on this list, but I didn't expect number one to be number one so easily. The second place film was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which kind of surprised me that that was in second. Not that it's not a great movie, it is, with 26 votes. Then we have E.T. the Extraterrestrial with 22 votes, Schindler's List with 21 votes, Jaws with 19 votes. I think it's a bit undervoted, but hey, that's just my personal preference. Catch Me If You Can tied with Jaws with 19 votes. Raiders of the Lost Ark came in with 13 votes. Temple of Doom came in at 12 votes, and Saving Private Ryan came in at 10 votes. These were all the movies that had double-digit numbers of votes. There were just as many that had single-digit numbers. So similarly to when I asked the Tom Cruise question, Steven Spielberg has had such a long career that a lot of people spread the love for a lot of different movies. But Jurassic Park, number one with a bullet as far as my members' favorite Steven Spielberg movie. And if you want to be a member here on the channel, you can check the description below. You get not only access to a member poll every week here on the channel, you also get early access to a lot of my videos, custom badges and emoji for the chat, and more. And I'd love to have you become a member. Come join in. I want to hear your voice on these polls. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Obsession, and I want to look first of all at its place as far as the highest grossing horror films domestically. Now, I have done this list for any number of years, and the one thing I've learned about the horror genre is that it is very subjective as to what is or isn't a horror film, and every time I do the list, people say Signs shouldn't be on there, people say that The Sixth Sense shouldn't be on there, and I decided that I had to make some kind of an objective measurement as to what a horror movie is or isn't. So I went to something that I used when I did my A24 horror video, which is to go to 4 different sites that kind of cover a different array of movie opinions: Letterboxd, IMDb, Metacritic, and Rotten Tomatoes. If a movie is listed, if the genre is listed as horror, even if it's listed with other genres, on 3 of those 4 sites, then it counts as a horror film. If it's not, regardless of what I think, then it doesn't count as a horror film. And it was a way for me to try to settle this argument and have an objective criteria as close as we can get to what a horror film is. And naturally, I highly disagree with one of the results specifically, but this is the system we've chosen. Again, there was a lot of debate, and I try not to do debate on the show. This is a very metrics-heavy, numbers-heavy show. So this is a list of the 10 highest-grossing horror films domestically, but I have to say, I don't agree with the system's results here. Number 1 is It at $328.8 million, but number 2 is Beetlejuice, the sequel to Beetlejuice at $294.1 million. 3 of those 4 sites listed Beetlejuice as a horror film along with a comedy, etc. Strangely, the original Beetlejuice does not qualify under this system. But again, there was so much debate, I felt like I had to put some objective criteria down. I don't agree with the result here, but I'm including it for now because that's what the system produced. So currently, according to this system, it is the second highest grossing horror movie of all time domestically, followed by Jaws, Sinners, and I Am Legend. The Exorcist is in sixth place, followed by It Chapter 2 and World War Z. And Obsession has now entered the list. According to these criteria, it is the ninth highest grossing horror film of all time domestically, unadjusted for inflation, coming in just ahead of A Quiet Place. So even if you don't include Beetlejuice, it's still in the top 10. And of course, when you look at all these films, by far the lowest budget of any movie in this top 10. And the only movie of these, as far as a modern release that had a box office run even similar, is Sinners. But that one didn't even compare to what Obsession has done. And it is going to be climbing this list rapidly. So one of the most successful horror films of all time domestically. This was another interesting one. I only did 5 for these because research was very difficult to come by for these movies. Obsession has also become the highest grossing film ever acquired at a film festival, and the only one in this top 5 that wasn't acquired at Sundance. So $188.3 million, that puts it ahead of the Blair Witch Project, which grossed $140.5 million and was acquired out of the Sundance Film Festival. Little Miss Sunshine is at number 3, which made $59.8 million, also acquired out of Sundance, with Manchester by the Sea at number 4, $47.6 million, and Precious, based on the novel Push by Sapphire, acquired out of Sundance at $47.5 million. So one of the most successful horror films of all time, the most successful festival acquisition of all time, and one of the most amazing box office runs of all time. It's crazy that in a summer full of so many big blockbusters and movies from legendary directors like Steven Spielberg, the box office story, bar none of the summer so far, has been this little micro-budget indie that just will not quit at the box office. And it is positioned to enter another top 10 chart. These are the highest grossing movies domestically that never spent a weekend at number 1 at the domestic box office. Obsession has spent a few weekdays at number 1, but it's never been number 1 for the weekend. And probably by next week's show, it's going to be on this list, displacing Ice Age, Dawn of the Dinosaurs, and coming in behind Mission Impossible, The Final Reckoning. Oppenheimer, of course, is the highest grossing film domestically to never hit number 1 due to the fact that it was constantly behind Barbie. That was kind of a big thing about its release. And then we have a lot of Christmas releases. Sing, My Big Fat Greek Wedding is kind of similar to the box office run of Obsession. It's the third highest grossing film. Alvin and the Chipmunks has 2 movies on this list, the first movie and The Squeakquel. It's crazy that it just happened to work out like that both of these movies are on the list. Then we have A Star is Born at number 6. That was largely behind Venom at the domestic box office, followed by Sherlock Holmes and World War Z. So Obsession will be on this chart next week, and again is positioned to really make a run up the chart pretty quickly. All right, let's talk a little bit about Scary Movie, aka Scary Movie 6. Right now, it is the 4th highest grossing film in the Scary Movie franchise at $84.2 million. It'll be above Scary Movie 4 by next week's show. It'll be the 3rd highest grossing film in franchise history, and we'll see where it goes from there. When you adjust for inflation, though, it is the 5th highest grossing film in the franchise, way ahead of Scary Movie 5, but also way behind Scary Movie 4. This is where it's going to stay on this list. Given the drop it had in weekend number 2, there's no way it gets to $150 million. So when you look at the inflation-adjusted numbers, the 6th movie will be in 5th place as far as the franchise goes. Of course, these were all big hits because the budgets on all of these movies were quite low. These are the highest grossing parody films of all time. Last week, we looked at where Scary Movie ranked as far as parody film openings. These are total parody film domestic grosses, and currently 2026's Scary Movie is the 9th highest grossing parody film of all time, just above Airplane, which is one of the definitive films in the genre. It's also just behind Young Frankenstein, The Naked Gun 2, Scary Movie 4, Scary Movie 3, Blazing Saddles, 2000's Scary Movie, and then Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me, and Austin Powers in Goldmember. Of course, seeing so many older films on this list, you know what's coming next, because I had to adjust these numbers for inflation to see what the highest grossing parody film of all time was when you adjust the dollar. And the number 1 movie easily is Blazing Saddles, which made over $800 million adjusted for inflation. It was a massive hit, and it came out the same year as the number 2 movie on this list, Young Frankenstein, at $582.7 million. So Mel Brooks brought in $1.3 billion, almost $1.4 billion of adjusted box office dollars in 1 year alone back in 1974. That is an insane achievement. Then we have Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me at $468 million, and Austin Powers and Goldmember at $425 million. Airplane comes in fifth place at $337.2 million, followed by the original Scary Movie at $335.2 million, the original Naked Gun at $221.7 million, then the Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear at $212.5 million, another Mel Brooks film, Silent Movie at $211.5 million, and then Scary Movie 3 at $208.7 million. So Scary Movie 2026 will not even sniff this list. The crazy thing about this is, of the top 10 here, 7 of the 10 involve Mel Brooks or Leslie Nielsen. So those two really are the godfathers of parody films. One movie that was not in the top 10 this past weekend was The Amazing Digital Circus, The Last Act. It was still in wide release this past weekend, but obviously its audience treated it as a must-see event on its opening weekend, largely because it's being released on YouTube and other platforms. So the rush to see it really was just in those first few days. And it actually had one of the biggest drop-offs ever for a movie, in any release structure. It was the 8th biggest drop-off by percentage, ahead of Undiscovered and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and right behind Billie Eilish, Hit Me Hard and Soft, which came out earlier this summer. Among movies that were still in wide release in their second weekend, so open in wide release and were still in wide release, The Amazing Digital Circus, The Last Act had the 4th biggest drop-off, right ahead of Boy Kills World, and again right behind Billie Eilish. The film Collide had the biggest second weekend drop-off of all time for a movie that opened in 1,000 theaters and was still in 1,000 theaters in weekend number 2, 88.5%. And then a mix of movies that just weren't very good, but mostly also one-weekend events that were rounding out the top 10. But at the same time, The Amazing Digital Circus made some history for Fathom. It was a Fathom Entertainment release, and it is the highest-grossing film in Fathom history that they originally distributed. It's also the second highest grossing Fathom Entertainment release of all time. Technically, the highest grossing Fathom Entertainment release was its 2024 re-release of Coraline, which brought in $33.6 million. Of course, they just handled distribution on a studio film that came out several years before. It's still number 1, though. The Amazing Digital Circus comes in second place, and it is tops among movies that originated their release with Fathom Entertainment at $24.9 million. That beats The Chosen, Last Supper Part 1 at $20.2 million, and The Blind at $17.2 million. Then we had Christmas with The Chosen rounding out the top 5, and the rest is all The Chosen. The Chosen Season 3, Episodes 1 and 2, The Chosen Season 4, Episodes 1 and 3, The Chosen Last Supper Part 2 and Part 3, and The Chosen Season 4, Episodes 4 through 6. So that partnership with Angel Studios and distributing The Chosen in theaters has generated an incredible amount of income for Fathom Events / Fathom Entertainment, and has really driven them to some of their biggest box office grosses of all time. 7 of their 10 highest grossing releases ever. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the show, this weekend, the big story is going to be the release of Toy Story 5. It's positioned to be the biggest opening for any movie in 2026. And that takes us to our trivia question for this week. The last couple I've heard were a little bit easier, so I really challenged you. If you were around back in 1995, then it might be easier for you to get the answer to this question. But I want to know, when the original Toy Story opened, back around Thanksgiving 1995, it shared the top 5 with a film from a long-running franchise, a comedy sequel, an action film, and the latest from a legendary director. What were those 5 movies? You may have to pause this to think about it. Toy Story was number 1 on its opening weekend. What were the other films in the top 5? I'll give you a second to think. Pause if you need a few more minutes, because here comes the answer. It was GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan's first film as James Bond, Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls, starring Jim Carrey, Money Train, starring Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson, and Casino from Martin Scorsese. That was the top 5, and honestly, that's a pretty dang good top 5. 1995 was a year with a lot of different movies for different audiences, and all of them coexisted in that top 5 over Thanksgiving weekend. And that also takes us to our Charts with Dan member poll question for this week, and it also centers around Pixar. Of all the movies that Pixar has made, there are several that have never had sequels. Of course, Toy Story 5 is the 4th sequel to the original Toy Story. So what I want to know know from you members is, what Pixar film that doesn't have a sequel or an announced sequel like Coco should get one? The eligible answers are A Bug's Life, Ratatouille, WALL-E, Up, Brave, The Good Dinosaur, Onward, Soul, Luca, Turning Red, Elemental, Elio, and this year's Hoppers. And the way I'm doing it this week is how I've done it before. When you go to the member poll question, there will be comments from me. It'll say vote, and then it'll have the name of the movie next to it. Just give a thumbs up under that comment if that's the movie you think should have a sequel that doesn't have one or doesn't have one in development. Any other comments that are made outside of those vote comments won't be counted toward the vote total. It just helps make tabulation a little bit easier. So you can vote right now in that member poll. Out of those films, which one do you think actually does deserve the sequel treatment from Pixar? All right, let's turn our attention now to the worldwide box office. And this section is actually going to be a little slim because I rely on ComScore, which I think is also now known as Rentrack, to give me my international box office data, my worldwide box office data. And as of the time I recorded this show, which was pretty late on Monday night, they just didn't update it. Like the date on the page that has all the international and worldwide data was updated, but the box office data was still from last weekend. And so I don't have most of the worldwide data. I had to kind of cobble together what I could from various different sources. And I have to say that the box office reporting sites in general have been very subpar lately. Of course, Box Office Mojo was stripped of a lot of its functionality years ago. The Numbers is a shell of itself and has been for weeks now. And now ComScore was behind on updating an entire week's worth of worldwide data. As much as I wish I could go out there and get all those numbers myself, I am reliant somewhat on the sources that carry those numbers. And when those sources don't have the numbers I need, it's hard to put together this show. So what I do have this week are the top 5 films worldwide. That's the best I could find. So this is all markets, including international markets and the US and Canada. At number 1 was Disclosure Day, which opened to $92.8 million worldwide. Again, that's not a bad opening given the budget of the film, and we'll see where it goes from here. Scary Movie dropped 64.9% worldwide to bring in another $37 million. It's at 172.8 globally, and again, based off of its budget point, it is a big hit, just not a very resilient one. Obsession doing what it does. It dropped just 21.2% to bring in another $34.1 million. Its global total is approaching $300 million. Backrooms dropped 53.6% worldwide for a $23.2 million total and a $248.7 million global total. And Michael dropped just 6.3% because it opened in Japan. I think this is the last major international market remaining for that film. It made $21.6 million. Its worldwide total now at $934 million. And that Japan opening may just be what the movie needs to boost it into the $1 billion club. Of course, I'll be tracking that as the weeks go on. Much like we saw domestically, Disclosure Day had the 10th highest opening for any film worldwide this year at $93.4 million. That puts it just behind Scream 7's opening at $96.7 million, and it will be bumped off this list by Toy Story 5, which looks to have a massive domestic and international weekend this upcoming weekend. And I said I was going to make a note on Michael. It has now passed Bohemian Rhapsody to become the highest grossing music biopic of all time worldwide at $934 million. Like Bohemian Rhapsody, it was a slow burn to get to that total, but it has now passed that movie's global total. So just another list where Michael, like Michael Jackson the musician, occupies the number 1 spot. All right, let's take a look at some other charts for this past weekend, and we will start with an update on the summer box office domestically. Scary Movie is now the 5th highest grossing movie of the summer, moving up 2 spots from last week. That puts it very healthily behind Backrooms. The Mandalorian and Grogu, the 2nd highest grossing film of the summer. Obsession is at number 2, and honestly, if Toy Story 5 weren't opening this weekend, I think it could very easily become, for a time, the highest grossing movie of the summer. However, Toy Story 5 is looking to put up huge numbers, and I don't know if Obsession could get up to where Devil Wears Prada 2 is right now before it's beaten by Toy Story 5. But still, the fact that it's even threatening to be the number 1 movie of the summer in mid-June is absolutely crazy. Mortal Kombat 2 and The Sheep Detectives are both down 1 spot from last week at numbers 6 and 7. Masters of the Universe is at number 8. Disclosure Day enters the summer box office top 10 at number 9. The Amazing Digital Circus, which I inadvertently omitted from in this list last week is down one spot to number 10, and Passenger drops out of the summer top 10. And just as a reminder of what my summer predictions were, currently I have 4 movies that I listed in my top 10 that are in release. I picked The Devil Wears Prada 2 and The Mandalorian and Grogu to be the 6th and 7th highest grossing movies of the summer. Right now they're at number 1 and number 3. And I picked Scary Movie and Disclosure Day to be the number 9 and 10 highest grossing movies of the summer. Right now they are at number 5 and number 9. So we'll see where all of that shakes up. Of course, my pick to be the highest grossing movie of the summer, Toy Story 5, opens on Friday. Let's take a look now at what I call some of our specialty charts, and we will start with the top per theater averages this past weekend. At number 1 was Disclosure Day, which brought in an average of $11,645 per theater in each of its 3,824 theaters. Then we have Obsession, still bringing in over $6,000 per theater. It actually added theaters again this past weekend. It added about 20 theaters, so it's now in 3,068 theaters. At number 3 was Chum, which brought in $5,405 in just one theater. Chum is a horror film from IFC about day sailors who are fending off both a shark and a psycho killer. I don't know, sounds like my kind of Saturday night, couple beers kind of movie. At number 4 is the Ben McKenzie documentary, Everyone is Lying to You for Money, which continues a very limited rollout in special engagements around the country. It brought in $4,783 per theater in just 2 theaters, and Scary Movie rounds out the top 5 at just over $4,000 per theater in each of its 3,504 theaters. These were the top films in limited release, which I define as fewer than 1,000 theaters. It was not a huge week in the limited release market. At number 1 was Tuner, which had a theater decrease to 351 theaters. It brought in $246,000 total. At number 2, we had Carolina Caroline in just 60 theaters, bringing in $26,000 total, a big drop-off. This is a film about a couple committing crimes in the American South, starring Samara Weaving and Kyle Gallner. At number 3 is the animated film Jinsei, bringing in $22,000 total in 155 theaters. Then we have the 30th anniversary of Trainspotting, bringing in $14,000 in 25 theaters. And the documentary Time and Water, bringing in $11,000 in 23 theaters. These are some of the lowest totals that I can ever remember on a limited release chart. This is what the 2026 annual domestic box office looks like. The Super Mario Galaxy movie currently number 1. Michael's at number 2. I think for some reason I might have had it and Project Hail Mary swapped last week, but it is the second highest grossing domestic film of the year at $362.8 million. Project Hail Mary is at number 3 at $343.7 million. The Devil Wears Prada 2 is the 4th highest grossing film of the year. Obsession, now the 5th highest grossing movie of the year domestically. Hoppers moves down 1 spot to number 6, followed by The Mandalorian and Grogu, Backrooms, Scream 7, and GOAT. And these are the top 10 movies at the worldwide box office this year. Wuthering Heights is down 2 spots to number 10 at $241.6 million. The Chinese film Dear You is out of the top 10. Backrooms enters the chart at number 9 at $248.7 million. Obsession is up 2 spots. Obsession is now the 8th highest grossing film of the year globally, at $287.1 million off of a budget of less than $1 million and an acquisition cost of $15 million. Astounding. The Mandalorian and Grogu is at number 7, followed by Hoppers at number 6. Pegasus 3 is at number 5. The Devil Wears Prada 2 is at number 4. Project Hail Mary is at number 3. Michael is, again, approaching that $1 billion mark. It's only about $65 million away. It's at number 2. And we currently have the only movie with $1 billion so far this year, the Super Mario Galaxy movie at $1,004.9 million at number 1. We'll see if Toy Story 5 can make a serious threat to grab that number 1 spot. So those are the box office numbers I have for you this week. Before we go, I also want to take a look at the world of streaming, and we'll start with the latest numbers from Netflix. New ones will be released later today, but this covers the week of June 1st through the 7th, and the number 1 program globally on Netflix was the Jennifer Lopez film Office Romance, which brought in 20.92 million views. In second place was the Netflix docuseries Michael Jackson, The Verdict. I'm sure it was a complete coincidence as far as when it was released. It brought in 17.85 million views. The Witness comes in third place with 13.2 million views. The Witness is a Netflix limited series about a young boy who is the only witness to his mother's murder, and it's based on a true story. At number 4 is Creed 3 with 7.9 million views, and right below it is the movie in which Michael B. Jordan is a voice actor, Swapped, at 7.53 million views. Probably not a surprise. I would imagine with Creed 3 rotating onto the platform, there were a lot of recommendations going from Swapped to another Michael B. Jordan film, maybe how they both made the top 5. At number 6 is The Marked Woman, a Netflix movie bringing in 6.55 million views. It's a film from Spain about a woman with amnesia. At number 7 is Teach You a Lesson at 6.43 million views. This is a Netflix original series out of South Korea about teachers taking on troubled schools and students. At number 8 is the animated film David, which had a big box office run last spring with 6.17 million views. At number 9, and this is interesting, is a Netflix original documentary called The Murder of Rachel Nichol, and it is about the murder that's the subject of the series The Witness, which is the number 3 program on Netflix. So 2 programs about the same thing in the Netflix top 10 globally. The Murder of Rachel Nichol is bringing in 6.13 million views. And at number 10 is The Crash, another original Netflix crime documentary at 5.75 million views. When you look at this Netflix top 10, 4 of the top 10 global programs are either true crime documentaries or inspired by true crime. That is the state of Netflix in 2026. Looking at the biggest debuts for a new series on Netflix this year, Michael Jackson, The Verdict, had the second biggest debut with 17.85 million views of any new series so far in 2026, behind only His and Hers, which debuted with 19.88 million views back on the first weekend of the year, January 5th. Then we have Reality Check, Inside America's Next Top Model. Tyra Banks is now suing the producers of that documentary. It debuted with 14.23 million views. Man on Fire at number 4 with 10.99 million views. And Should I Marry a Murderer rounding out the top 5 at 10.65 million views. And these are the most watched programs on Netflix in 2026. War Machine still holding the top spot at 128.4 million views. Apex is at number 2 at 117 million views, followed by The Rip at 114.71 million views, but right behind is Swapped at 114.70 million views. K-pop Demon Hunters down to number 5, but it still brought in 113 million views just since the first weekend of January. Bridgerton Season 4 is at number 6, followed by His and Hers and Thrash. The Crash moves up to be the 9th highest viewed program on Netflix this year at 59 million views, which bumps People We Meet on Vacation down to number 10 at 54.32 million views. And sometime around the end of June, beginning of July, we should get the full Netflix report containing all of the viewing data for the first 6 months of the year. This is compiled off of the shows that are appearing on the various top 10 lists that Netflix releases. And once I get that data, of course, I'm going to crunch it, and I will give you a much more accurate and up-to-date look at the top 10 most viewed programs through the first 6 months of the year. These are the latest Nielsen ratings. Now, they're US ratings only, and they're delayed by about a month because that's how long it takes Nielsen to do it. These were the 10 most watched streaming movies here in the US for the week of May 11th through the 17th. At number 1 was the debut of GOAT on Netflix, which brought in 17.8 million hours watched. Then we have A Remarkably Bright Creatures at 14.5 million hours watched. Swapped still in the top 3 at 8.5 million hours watched. This was the week that The Crash debuted on Netflix, and here in the US, it brought in 7.9 million hours of watch time. Mother's Day is at number 5, followed by Send Help on Hulu. Greenland 2, Migration on HBO Max at number 7 with 3.45 million hours watched. At number 8 is a film from 2023, I believe, called Stolen Baby, The Murder of Heidi Broussard, which is a literal Lifetime original true crime movie. So true crime is really a dominant force on the streaming charts as it is on the podcasting charts. Home on Netflix is at number 9 with 2.93 million hours watched. And then we have the Netflix documentary about Martin Short called Marty, Life is Short at 2.916 million hours watched. These were the 10 most watched streaming shows for May 11th through 17th. At number 1 was The Roast of Kevin Hart on Netflix at 22.46 million hours watched. So that's special presentation, easily the top show of the week. The Boys on Amazon holding in at number 2 at 16.86 million hours watched. Then we have La Brea at 16.61 million hours watched. Bluey at number 4. Nemesis on Netflix debuting at number 5 with 13.8 million hours watched, followed by Grey's Anatomy, The Big Bang Theory, SpongeBob SquarePants, and Worst Ex Ever. And then Dutton Ranch on Paramount Plus. Despite having just 2 episodes available for that week, It still made the top 10 at just over 12 million hours watched total. And when we look at the top shows as far as watch time per available episode, Dutton Ranch moves all the way up to number 1 because it brought in an average of over 6 million hours of watch time per episode for each of its 2 episodes. Nemesis coming in second place with 1.73 million hours of watch time per episode, followed by Worst X Ever at 1.56 million, and On Campus, which has been a very buzzy show, at just over 1 million hours of watch time per episode. Ms. Rachel's at number 5, followed by MIA, La Brea, Euphoria, which was close to wrapping up its run, The Boys at number 9, and Your Friends and Neighbors, close to the end of its second season with 353,000 hours per episode. And looking at the top performances so far this year, as far as watch time per episode, excluding specials where there's only 1 episode, so that would include things like the Roast of Kevin Hart, His and Hers is still at number 1. It brought in about 6.23 million hours of watch time per episode back on the week of January 12th. But Dutton Ranch comes in right behind with 6.04 million, ahead of Reality Check, Inside America's Next Top Model. Then His and Hers take number 4 and number 5 on this list with 3.85 million hours of watch time per episode in its debut week and 3.81 million hours of watch time per episode on the week of January 19th. So His and Hers really dominant back in the month of January, and we see that a lot on these charts. Usually when Netflix releases a new series in January, people are kind of winding down from the holidays, and we see a lot of watch time, especially on crime, murder, that kind of thing. And those are all the numbers I have for you this week. Before we go, I wanted to take a look at some things you might be interested in watching, both at home and in theaters. It's kind of a light week, but there's some interesting things still. First of all, on Thursday, Project Hail Mary will make its streaming debut on the little-known streaming service MGM+. It's not streaming initially on Amazon Prime Video. It's streaming on MGM+. So if you have it, and I don't know anyone who does, you can start watching Project Hail Mary at home on Thursday. Then on Friday, we have a few movies hitting theaters. Of course, we have Toy Story 5, which is hitting theaters around the country. There were no advanced screenings of Toy Story 5 anywhere in my region, so I'm going to go see it on Thursday. I'll have my review out on Thursday night or Friday morning. The Death of Robin Hood will also be hitting theaters across the country. This is the latest film from writer-director Michael Sarnowski, who's made 2 films that I enjoyed, Pig and A Quiet Place Day One. It's a deconstruction of the Robin Hood myth starring Hugh Jackman. Also hitting many theaters across the country is Leviticus, which is the debut film from writer-director Adrian Chiarella. I have been talking this movie up since I saw it at Sundance. It was one of the standout films of the festival for me. It is a horror film about a malevolent entity that takes the form of the person you love the most, and it menaces 2 teenage boys in love, played by Joe Bird, who was great as the brother in Talk to Me, and Stacey Clausen, who also appeared in the Netflix movie Thrash. I may do a standalone review for this film here on the channel. I'd like to get a chance to check it out, see if it's changed since Sundance, but I really, really liked this movie. Also in many theaters around the country this weekend is Girls Like Girls, starring Maya DaCosta and Myra Malloy. They also play 2 teenagers in love, but as far as I know, they are not being menaced by a malevolent entity. The film is from music star turned director and co-writer Haley Kiyoko. And on Sunday, House of the Dragon Season 3 debuts on HBO and HBO Max. Like many people, I was underwhelmed by the second season, but the early reviews for Season 3 have been very positive, so I will be tuning in. Always excited to see what House Targaryen is up to. And that's all I've got for you this week. As I mentioned, I'll have my review of Toy Story 5 later this week here on the channel. I have my live show on Wednesday afternoon where you can ask your questions, and I like to dive into some weird stories around the entertainment industry, and you never know what else might pop up. I've been working on some long-term projects. Maybe I can get one of them out for the weekend. I don't know. It's the summer. You never know what's going to happen. But thank you so much for watching. We are back today on our regular day of Tuesday. Next week, charts will return to Mondays because next week I will be going to see an advanced screening of Supergirl on Monday. So the show will be out on Monday. The review of Supergirl will be out on Wednesday next week, which is when the review embargo drops. So mark your calendars for that. But most of all, thank you for watching this episode. If you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell so you know when I upload new videos. And thanks as always for investing this much time into me just talking about numbers. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.